The return begins before anyone notices. The Scripture rarely announces restoration the way people expect. There is no trumpet in the first movement, no public declaration that the silence has ended. Instead, the return begins the same way the departure began, quietly. This is why many miss it. People imagine restoration as the reversal of pain in a single moment. But Scripture shows something different. Restoration starts inside ordinary life, long before it is recognized as restoration. After exile, the land does not immediately look transformed. The people do not suddenly become powerful. The structures are not instantly glorious. What changes first is alignment. Hearts begin to soften. Prayer becomes honest again. Longing becomes steady rather than desperate. Return begins where attention returns. And this is why Scripture describes restoration using small images. A remnant returning. A wall is being rebuilt stone by stone. A lamp is burning quietly. A seed taking root. None of these looks like triumph. They look like beginnings. This is the first truth. The return of presence often starts at a scale that pride cannot recognize. God does not restore through spectacle because spectacle attracts possession instead of reverence. He restores through smallness because smallness protects what is holy. The hidden movement of return. Notice how Scripture speaks when restoration begins. Not behold, everything is new, but do not despise the day of small beginnings. Why? Because return arrives in ways that test the heart. Those who crave former glory feel disappointed. Those who are attentive recognize mercy. The watchers among the adopted children, formed during silence, are the first to sense this shift. Not because they hold authority, but because they learn to notice movement without noise. They recognize a change in weight, a subtle peace returning, a renewed clarity in the word, a quiet reordering of relationships. Nothing dramatic, but unmistakable to those who have lived long in absence. The daughter and the early return. During this early movement, the daughter does not suddenly step into public visibility. She remains veiled. Why? Because premature exposure invites misunderstanding. Return must first establish order, not recognition. Scripture shows that whenever God begins to restore, he does it in hidden ways, protecting what is forming from the pressure of expectation. The daughter's concealment during this phase is not delayed. It is alignment. She is not absent. She is present in ways that are relational, not public. Those who expect announcement miss her movement. Those who honor quietness perceive her influence. Why most people miss the beginning. Scripture is honest about this. Many who long for restoration still fail to recognize its arrival. Why? Because they expect restoration to look like memory. They look for the former structure, the former power, the former visibility. But God restores differently. He restores through humility, through small obedience, through hidden faithfulness. And this creates a dividing line, not of status, but of perception. Some say nothing has changed. Others say something is shifting. Both are standing in the same moment, but only one has learned to see through silence. The gentle law of early return. Here is the deeper principle. God reintroduces presence slowly so that hearts adjust before glory increases. Too much nearness too quickly would overwhelm what is still healing. So return arrives like dawn, not as a sudden blaze, but as light that grows. Scripture shows this rhythm again and again. First alignment, then rebuilding, then renewal, finally visible glory. And this order protects the household, because restoration is not meant to impress the world. It is meant to heal the people. Resting movement. Beloved, if you're expecting a moment that changes everything overnight, Scripture gently invites you to look closer. Return may already be beginning in ways that do not demand attention. It may look like patience replacing urgency, quiet obedience replacing striving, clarity replacing confusion, trust replacing fear. These are not small things. They are the first signs that presence is drawing near again, and those who learn to watch during silence will not rush ahead. They will remain steady, honoring the restoration without forcing it into visibility. Why early return is entrusted to humility. Scripture shows that when restoration begins, God does not entrust it to strength, influence, or visibility. He entrusts it to humility. This is not accidental. Humility is the only posture that can carry returning presence without trying to possess it. After silence, people often expect restoration to arrive through power, a sudden shift, a public sign, a moment that proves everything has changed. But God rarely restores that way because power attracts control, and control repeats the very patterns that caused withdrawal. So early return is given to those who have learned to walk lightly. They rebuild without claiming ownership. They recognize movement without announcing authority. They receive without trying to define. This is why Scripture emphasizes rebuilding in small acts, stones laid quietly, lamps kept burning, prayers offered without audience. These acts look ordinary, but they carry extraordinary weight because they restore trust between heaven and earth. Humility becomes the vessel of return. Not because humility is weak, but because humility leaves room for God to lead the pace. How Scripture protects restoration from premature exposure. There is another reason early return remains hidden: protection. When restoration begins, it is fragile. Not fragile because God is uncertain, but because people are still healing. Too much exposure invites comparison, criticism, or expectation that pulls restoration out of its proper rhythm. So Scripture shows God shielding early movements. He works through remnant communities rather than crowds. He speaks through quiet voices rather than loud declarations. He builds through processes rather than events. This is the same pattern seen in the concealment of the daughter. Her veiling during early return is not distance. It is protection from misrecognition. The household must be reordered before visibility increases. If revelation comes too soon, people respond with projection instead of reverence. So early return stays relational. It grows through obedience, not announcement. And this is why many people overlook it, because they are waiting for confirmation that matches their expectations, while God is restoring through faithfulness that looks almost ordinary. How the children learn to walk with presence again. As return begins, the adopted children face a new challenge. Silence taught them endurance. Now nearness teaches them responsibility. Walking with presence, again, is not the same as remembering presence. It requires relearning. Listening instead of striving, receiving instead of controlling, honoring order instead of rushing ahead. Some feel excitement and want to accelerate what is happening. Others hesitate, unsure whether the silence has truly lifted. Scripture allows both responses to exist, but it gently guides the children toward steadiness. Presence returning is like learning to walk after a long illness. Every step matters. Every movement must be intentional. The watchers among the adopted children help stabilize this process, not by leading, but by remaining grounded. Their watchfulness becomes a quiet influence, reminding the household to move at the pace of grace rather than urgency. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the people begin to recognize something they had nearly forgotten. God is near again, not in overwhelming glory yet, but in restored alignment. The deep law beneath. Return does not erase the silence. It fulfills it. Everything formed during waiting becomes the foundation for restoration. Humility learned in exile becomes strength in rebuilding. Faithfulness practiced without reward becomes a source of stability in nearness. Adoption lived through obedience becomes an inheritance carried with reverence. So the early stages of return feel gentle, even understated. But Scripture invites you to see them differently. They are not small. They are sacred beginnings. Yes, there is one more deep layer, and it rests quietly beneath everything we have said. There is a reason Scripture describes the beginning of return as gentle rather than overwhelming. When presence draws near again, the first thing God restores is not power, not visibility, not recognition, but trust. After a long silence, hearts are careful. The children have learned to live without constant reassurance. They have learned to walk by memory and covenant rather than sensation. If glory returned suddenly, it would not feel like healing. It would feel like disruption. So God restores through familiarity. Small obediences begin to carry weight again. Prayer feels steady rather than strained. Scripture opens with quiet clarity. Relationships begin to align without force. These movements are easy to overlook because they do not announce themselves. But Scripture shows that trust grows through repetition, not spectacle. This is why early return often feels almost hidden inside ordinary faithfulness. The land is still the same, the people are still the same, yet something subtle has shifted. The distance is no longer absolute. And this is where many struggle because they expect restoration to erase the memory of exile. But Scripture does not erase memory, it redeems it. The children do not forget the silence. They carry its wisdom into nearness. They learn to walk carefully, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what has been restored. Trust becomes mutual again. The people trust God's nearness. God entrusts them with greater nearness. And slowly, without announcement, the household begins to breathe differently. Not louder, not grander. Just alive again. This is why early return cannot be rushed into visibility. Trust must deepen before glory can increase. Because glory without trust would recreate the same distance that exile once produced. So the presence returns like a rhythm being restored, step by step, breath by breath, until the people no longer walk as strangers to nearness, but as those who remember both silence and mercy. As trust begins to return, Scripture shows another movement taking place, a quiet reordering of weight. During exile, many things felt heavy that were never meant to carry the heart. Fear, survival, performance, the effort to hold everything together without nearness. The children learned to endure, but endurance alone cannot sustain restoration. So when presence draws near again, the first change is not outward, it is interior lightness. Burdens that once felt permanent begin to loosen, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because alignment shifts. What once demanded constant effort now begins to rest under grace. This is one of the earliest signs of return. The soul stops striving to produce what only God can give. Scripture describes this without spectacle. A yoke becomes easy. A lamp burns without strain. A remnant walks forward without forcing the path. And this is where many misinterpret the moment. They expect glory to arrive with intensity, yet the first sign of restoration is often relief, a holy easing that allows the children to breathe again. The adopted children, shaped by silence, learn a new posture here. They do not rush to reclaim what was lost. They move slowly, honoring the rhythm of return. They rebuild without anxiety because they understand that nearness is not something they generate, it is something they receive. This is why Scripture places so much emphasis on rebuilding ordinary life during restoration. Fields are planted, homes are repaired, worship becomes sincere rather than dramatic. These acts appear simple, but they are sacred because they mark the return of stability. Stability is the soil where glory can safely grow. And within this quiet rebuilding, the veiled daughter remains present in relational rather than visible ways. Her influence is felt in the gentleness of the process, in how healing unfolds without pressure, and in how identity settles without striving. She does not rush ahead of the household. She moves with it, guarding the pace of restoration. Because return is not only about presence coming back, it is about the people learning to live with presence again, without fear or excess. This is why Scripture teaches patience even during restoration. Those who learned watchfulness during silence continue to move carefully. They do not grasp for more than what has been given. They honor the slow increase of light. And slowly, something remarkable happens. The memory of exile no longer defines the future. Not erased, but transformed. What once felt like distance becomes testimony of mercy. What once felt like waiting becomes proof of formation. The children realize they are no longer surviving silence. They are walking inside renewal. Return has begun, even if the world has not noticed. When the presence begins to return, the first transformation is inward. But Scripture never allows restoration to remain only inside the heart. What is healed within eventually begins to shape what is seen without. Yet the movement outward is careful. God does not reveal glory before the household learns steadiness. If light expands too quickly, it overwhelms what is still learning to live gently. So restoration spreads the way, dawn spreads across the horizon, gradually, faithfully, without interruption. At first, only a few notice. A word spoken carries weight again. Worship feels alive rather than practiced. Obedience feels natural rather than forced. These are not dramatic signs, but they are unmistakable to those who have long lived in the absence. The watchers among the adopted children recognize that something has shifted, not because they are searching for change, but because they have learned to discern the difference between effort and grace. And as alignment stabilizes, Scripture shows God allowing restoration to become visible through order. Walls are rebuilt. Gatherings become sincere. Justice begins to return quietly to the land. Notice what becomes visible first. Not power, not influence, not fame, but rightness. Relationships begin to reflect covenant again. Leadership becomes humble rather than proud. The people begin to carry themselves with peace rather than urgency. This is visible glory in its earliest form. Not light that blinds, but life that heals. And here the daughter's veiling continues to protect the process. Her presence shapes the atmosphere of restoration, yet she does not step forward prematurely. Visibility waits until the household can honor what is revealed without projecting fear or expectation onto it. Because glory is not meant to impress, it is meant to dwell. Scripture shows that once hidden alignment becomes steady, God allows restoration to extend outward, first to the household, then to the community, and only later to the wider world. This expansion is organic, not forced. It grows from faithfulness, not ambition. And this is where many misunderstand the nature of visible glory. They imagine it as a sudden arrival, a moment that proves everything is changed. But Scripture shows glory appearing like fruit on a tree that has been quietly nourished for a long season. By the time fruit is seen, the real work has already happened beneath the surface. So the children learn to walk differently. They no longer chase signs. They no longer measure progress by visibility. They remain grounded in trust, allowing God to determine the pace of revelation. And, as they do, restoration becomes undeniable. Not because it shouts, but because it endures. Where once there was fragmentation, there is now cohesion. Where once there was striving, there is now rest. Where once there was distance, there is now nearness that feels safe. Visible glory grows from hidden alignment, just as light grows from dawn into day. As hidden alignment becomes steady, Scripture shows a moment when restoration crosses a threshold. Not a sudden explosion, not a spectacle meant to overwhelm, but a point where the change can no longer be denied. The people begin to realize that what once felt fragile has become firm. Prayer no longer feels like reaching into distance. It feels like conversation again. Obedience no longer feels like effort. It feels like agreement. The household moves together without the strain that exile once produced. This is when increased glory begins to rest among them. But Scripture is careful here. Glory does not arrive to erase humility. It arrives to confirm it. Everything the children learned during silence, patience, watchfulness, trust, becomes the foundation that allows nearness to deepen without repeating the past. They no longer try to hold glory as proof of identity. They carry it as a gift entrusted to them. And this is the true sign that restoration has matured. The people stop asking whether God is near. They begin to ask how to live responsibly in His nearness. Visible change follows naturally. Peace becomes recognizable. Justice becomes ordinary rather than heroic. Worship feels grounded rather than intense. Those who once longed desperately now walk quietly because longing has become fulfillment. Not perfect fulfillment, but real enough that fear no longer leads. The adopted children discover that inheritance is not about elevation. It is about participation, living within the rhythm of presence without trying to control it. And the daughter's veiling, which protected the early stages, begins to soften, not as a sudden unveiling, but as a gentle increase of recognition within a relationship. The household has learned enough humility to honor what is revealed without grasping. Scripture shows that this is when restoration becomes unmistakable, not because the world applauds, but because the people themselves are transformed. Where once there was uncertainty, there is now steadiness. Where once there was waiting, there is now walking. Where once there was silence, there is now quiet communion. This is the completion of the early return. Not an ending, but a settled beginning. A household that has learned to live with presence again, carrying increased glory without losing the humility that protected its birth. When the quiet return becomes living glory, beloved, Scripture shows that restoration does not arrive to overwhelm the household, but to settle within it. What began as silence became formation, what formed in hiddenness became alignment, and what aligned in humility slowly grew into visible glory that could be carried without fear. The adopted children, shaped by waiting, learned to walk with presence again, not grasping, not rushing, but receiving with reverence. The daughter, once veiled for protection, remains honored within the order of return, guiding the pace so that nearness heals rather than overwhelms. And so the household discovers that restoration is not a moment of triumph, but a life of steady communion. Prayer becomes conversation, obedience becomes agreement, and worship becomes rest rather than striving. Do not look for restoration only in spectacle. Look for it in the quiet weight of peace, the gentleness of right order, and the humility that remains even as glory increases. The God who withdrew carefully has returned carefully, and those who learned to trust in silence now walk in nearness with wisdom, carrying the light not as possession, but as a sacred dwelling entrusted to them. Thank you for being here. If this teaching helped you, please like, comment, and share. It truly helps this message reach those who are seeking. To our new subscribers, welcome. And if you'd like to go deeper, we invite you to join as a member. The link is in the description and on our homepage. We are praying for you and standing with you in the light of Messiah, he, and Messiah, she. If you'd like to support the ministry, you can visit our store or bless our dear brother Michael via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, which also includes a link to our second store with new designs. Thank you for your love and encouragement, and stay tuned for the next video. May the spirit of wisdom and peace rest upon you always.